I'm Giovanni Bazzana. I'll introduce Willis Barnstone by thanking him, first of all, for coming and preparing a wonderful lecture that I have already read, and I can say will blow you away. and also I have to thank the Dean and the Dean's office for supporting this event and helping me very much throughout. Willis Barnstone doesn't need a presentation, but since it's canonical, I'll do a little presentation anyway. Short, I promise. Willis is a native of Maine and grew up in New York City and studied at Columbia University and then at Yale. He has traveled almost throughout the entire known world, particularly in Mexico, Greece, China, France. Is just coming back from Paris. So all of these nice places. He has been a distinguished professor of comparative literature and Spanish at Indiana University. But most importantly, Willis has published extensively as a poet, so that he has been nominated several times for the Pulitzer Prize, as a memoirist. So he just showed me one of the last books he published about his memoirs of long-standing friendship and collaboration with Jose Luis Borges. And finally, what's important for this event tonight, he has been a translator from many different, an impressive array of different languages, obviously Spanish, where he has translated works as diverse as Antonio Machado and St. John of the Cross, but also from Chinese poetry and what is really interesting, ancient Greek poetry. He has translated the delicate poetry of Sappho, but also the notoriously obscure philosophical fragments of Heraclitus. But what has occupied him for the last few years has been a focus on biblical text, understood in a very open sense, so not just canonical text, but if you look at some of his publications, like the Other Bible, which includes writings as diverse as Jubilees and the Passion of Perpetua and Felicitas, or the Gnostic Bible, that is the result of a years-long collaboration with Marvin Meyer. But I would say that Barnstone's engagement with biblical texts is not only a literary enterprise, but also the result of many years spent studying these books and their historical context. So this is borne out, I think, it's the crown achievement, I think, of Barnstone's work on biblical text, which is the Restored New Testament, that book that you see here. The Restored New Testament is an intriguing and provocative attempt to restore the Jewish character of the Christian sacred books by way of translating them anew and reversing the century-long tradition of obfuscation of the Jewish roots. So this is this enterprise, and the motives behind it, the reasons behind it, are very much, something that is close to the school and what the faculty, both in Jewish studies and New Testament studies, wants to do for here. So it is with great pleasure that I invite you to salute Willis Barnstone.
Well, such a pleasure to be here. One of my sons went to Harvard Architectural School here, and I used to come often to sleep on his basement floor and help him write papers, and I used to stay with Juan Marichal in Spanish, who was the chair of the Romance Language Department each time I came, and he was one of the great historians of Spain and of modern Spanish literature as well. So for many, many years, I would somehow end up in the city where my dad was born in 1893, who left home at the age of 12, as people did in those days, and sold papers in the subway, and some had nickel lunches at Irish bars where you could eat the cold cuts as much as you want. I'm very nostalgic about this beautiful city. And I'm glad to see Professor Medina here to represent a profound aspect of my interests. A person born with a Mexican step family and all kinds of Greeks, and everything's there, all the good things. And a wife whom I met 30 years ago in China, who is a Chinese art historian. Is God a Jew? Is Jesus a Jew? Identity theft through language. Is God a Jew? Yes, God is a Jew. Is Jesus a Jew? Yes. Yes, God is a Jewish deity from the Near East, as the goddess Ishtar is a Babylonian in Mesopotamia, and the god Zeus on Mount Olympus is a Greek. Doubt the powers and tribal identity of a national god anywhere, and you have a war. God of many names is a Jew in both the Old Testament and the New Testament. A holy figure, Jesus, is he also a Jew? Yes, Jesus is a passionate, meditative Jew whose speech is wisdom poetry. Note that Matthew 1 establishes Jesus' Davidic descent, beginning with Abraham, Jacob, and Isaac, through Solomon and David to Joseph and Mary, or more properly, from Abraham, Jacob, and Yitzhak through Shlomo and David to Yosef and Miriam. And Lucas 3:23 traces Jesus' ancestry back to David, Abraham, and Adam, the son of God. What happens to a Jewish child on the 8th day? As observant Jews, Jesus' parents, Yosef and Miriam, take their baby to the temple where he is circumcised and gains the name Yeshua. Later, as a wandering rabbi in Judea and Galilee, he is addressed as rabbi 19 times. Know that rabbi in Hebrew and Greek means a rabbi, the Jewish leader of the temple and congregation, not a teacher or master, as it is deceptively translated. On the cross, Jesus abandons anti-Semitic postures and becomes a punished Jew of Roman rage. He cries out his last words to his Jewish God in Hebrew, Eli, Eli, lama atzvatani. My God, why have you forsaken me? Which is, as you people here know, line 1 of David's Psalm 22. With all these facts, there should be no clouds around Rabbi Yeshua to obscure his religion and ethnicity. Yet the Gospels clearly cast Jesus not as a Jew, but as a deracinated, non-Jewish enemy of the wicked Jew. And this ruse has worked for 2,000 years. We soon discover how these multiple denials operate. Despite the genealogies in the opening Matthew and Luke, neither Jesus nor his ancestors from David and Abraham to Adam are Jews. The denial of Jesus' Jewishness in the New Testament is complete. And in their own Jewish Bible, as we shall see, the Jews do not even exist. These shenanigans are theater of the absurd. The disappearance of the Jew in the Christian Old Testament and their emergence as villains in the New Testament is universal dogma. Such a scene is as unlikely as looking at the heavens and discovering the sun is a watermelon. Let us wonder back. How can the Jewish identity of both Adam and Eve in the garden and Yeshua suffering crucifixion in Jerusalem be unknown, at least popularly unknown? No longer, certainly not here. Since the beginning of Christendom, a cloud of misunderstanding has darkened minds of good people about who is the Jesus walking around the hills of Judea. Family and followers. If Jesus' family and followers are not Jews, have they fallen to earth from another solar system? One locally recognized group in the landscape is the duplicitous officials who forced the late St. Pilate or St. Pilatus to crucify the King of the Jews. In this Grimm Brothers tale of wicked warlock Jew who will be dropped into hell, all players on stage, ironically, the Holy Father as well as the Good Samaritan, are devout Jews. There are new Christians at the masked ball. At the climax of the Passion appear newborn Roman heroes. They are Pilate's soldiers who have just mocked Jesus, cast lots for his clothes, crucified him, broken his bones, and shoved a spear into his side to see if he bleeds. We read in Matthew, when the centurion and those with him guarding Yeshua saw the earthquake, they were terrified and said, "Surely he was the Son of God." Here are the world's first converts to Christianity. These are the brutal Romans who, during the chaos after King Herod's death in 4 BCE, the year of Jesus' birth, crucified up to 500 Jewish rebels a day. The ending of this tragedy becomes the Roman trophy of first recognition of Jesus' divinity. Christ killers are not evil, but holy soldiers in the future church of Rome. God is Jewish like his creations. Normatively, those who speak Hebrew in the Tanakh are Jews, including God. Hebrew is God's tongue, and his first biblical name is Elohim. He also operates his universe in Hebrew. The Godhead utters the words, "Be light," Yehi or, and speaks the cosmos into being. A few verses later, with the second name, Hashem, God is Yahweh. In the second creation, now in one day, he encloses Eve and Adam in a gated paradise. Both God and Eve and Adam speak elegant, poetic Hebrew. The same Yahweh, the Tetragrammaton, commands them not to eat from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, but in a gesture of post-protest and self-discovery, Adam and Eve act on their own. Our first Promethean hero, Eve, chooses to eat the Gnostic fruit of knowledge, but empowering knowledge is ever a punishable threat to authoritarian deities, whether it be Greek Uranus of the firmament, the Inca creator god Viracocha above the clouds of Cusco, or Jewish Yahweh in heaven. The punishment for Eve and Adam's first disobedience is mortality and expulsion, but also freedom. These first acts in Genesis by the director and by the actors in the grand theater of the world are performed in one language. Neither God nor players Eve, Moses, Job, and David need learn a new language. Even after Babel, which presumably divided people into mutually unintelligible tongues, Hebrew again prevails. Later, the God of broader Judea and Israel speaks to his flock in their common Jewish tongue. For the pluralistic world, loquacious God will eventually become multilingual, known everywhere, but only through translations of his original Hebrew speech into foreign language Bibles. God at central stage. If God is a Jew, does he look like a Jew? And do Jews look like God? Yes, in Genesis we learn that God created his people in his image. so he and his earthly actors should look alike. Indeed, the Jews are all people in anthropomorphic religions, and all peoples in anthropomorphic religions are godlike, and power gods have human appearances and qualities. And do not sell Bible God short with respect to tribalism. While God is wed to the Jewish people, as the ethnocentric Catalans and Scot nationalists are to their mythical aborigines, Lord Adonai is not uniformly parochial. He makes Ruth a hero. She is a foreign Moabitus who marries into the tribe, as well as Esther Hadassah, celebrated at Purim. Esther leaves her tribe to become queen of Persia and save fellow Jews from slaughter. God gives us Solomon's Song of Songs, the most beautiful erotic love book in the world, and source of John of the Cross's mystical spiritual canticles of the dark night of the soul. God also gives us the golden rule to love our neighbor and not to kill. But as we know in Porgy and Bess, it ain't necessarily so. God of the Jews, like all gods, is repeatedly guilty of barbaric slaughter. We see God supported Joshua, Jesus in Greek, murder all enemy inhabitants in Canaan villages. In his retell of Gilgamesh, God permits Noah to float away safe through the floods while all else on the globe die in global genocide. Likewise, while Jesus is the voice of love and hope, he is also militant Jesus, establishing extreme punishments for non-believers. While there is no afterlife in the Hebrew Bible, now Jesus is equipped with eternity to send unbelievers and sinners to everlasting punishment, grinding their teeth in pain forever in sulphurous Sodom and Gomorrah. The world religions do not abound in Plato's serene dream of justice. God of the Jews is also a one-man show. He is multi-talented and as imaginative as Chagall, making cows fly, angels float and wrestle, and whirlwinds talk. He gives Solomon his Herculean strength. God also fills our brain with the capacity to question and rebel, like the rebel sculptors who made golden calves looming in the desert. Indeed, all major players rebel as they find strength in God. Shakespearean Job passionately debates. Amazing Samson, who is hooked up with a shiksa, is blind. But when he is again God-empowered, he pulls down the huge stadium on his captors' heads and on his own. Contentious Jonah, in angry words with God, escapes from the whale's big belly and sails off to the western sea to seek freedom. This Semite God of the Jews wears many non-faces. He is intimate and constantly chatting and gossiping with his subjects. Yahweh leads, admonishes, and in the Psalms provides spiritual comfort and love. He also makes covenants. From the first days on earth in the flowery garden, he makes a deal with Adam. If his subjects follow the good, the Mashiach will arrive and lead his people out of danger to live in peace in lands of milk and honey. These passages provide the Gospels their main argument of the arrival of the Isaiah foretold Messiah. He will be the fabled itinerant rabbi Jesus. He will be also the Roman mock king of the Jews. But as Savior, he promises to bring his co-religionists, masked Jews, to heaven and earth. But who is this God of the Jews? Old Testament God is awful. For good Christians think of the God of the Jews, and when they do, God is awful. Some good people argue reasonably that God is everywhere and for everyone. or as Borges would say, God and Shakespeare are everyone and no one, not in practice. For millennia, most Christians in life and in their seminaries, except for the Lone Star Harvard Divinity School, assume that the God of the Jewish Bible miraculously changes character as he moves from the Old Testament Jehovah God of revenge to the New Testament merciful God of love and enlightenment. So though he is absent from the text, meaning New Testament text, having no voice, only a third person presence, and never directly addressed in the Gospels, somehow the New Testament God is in every way better and superior to the Old Testament grunt that is God. Who is God in the New Testament, and how come the scriptures are in Greek? We possess God's own words in Hebrew in the Jewish Bible. Does God speak Greek in the New Testament? Possibly in one phrase. In the first baptism in Mark, Yohanan is dunking Yeshua in the river Yarden. The Jewish purification bath is what later Christians call baptism, from Greek baptizo, dip. Then we read in stunning poetry, and straightway coming out of the water, he saw the heavens open, and the Spirit like a dove descending upon him, another voice from heaven saying, "Thou art my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased." Mark 1:10. Whether the voice is God or Holy Spirit, this phrase floating down from the sky is a translation of God's voice. Into the New Testament, Greek, God speaks only in Hebrew, and if here God speaks in Greek, his words are a translation from Hebrew into Koine. The Gospels themselves are unconvincingly said to be a translation from an unknown written or oral gospeling source in Aramaic and Hebrew. That theory suggests no early source. Some scholars suppose that there were Greek originals. If Greek is the original tongue, one asks, how did Jesus end up speaking Greek as he wanders through his brief life in Galilee and Judea? The Jews spoke Aramaic, as we know, and there are no Greek figures in the story. Greek was the language of the external Goyim, Hebrew for Gentiles, and not the tongue of any gospel figure. If you want in the question and answer, I have a lot of thoughts on this question of why we have it in Greek and how they got away with something. It has to do with the time that the Gospels were composed as opposed to Paul and the others. Of Paul and authenticity of the Gospel story of Jesus' life. Strangely, the life of Jesus was unknown to Paul the Pharisee. Jesus' contemporary in Jerusalem, learned and informed Paul, knew about the crucifixion of the Isaiah foretold Messiah, who was Jesus Christ. However, he knew no thought, no miracle, no significant event in Jesus' life except his crucifixion. No events in the temples, no ride on a donkey into Jerusalem, no Last Supper, no Peter, and no Judas. Paul died before the Gospels were invented, along with these main characters. As a Jewish reformer, he created a new Judaism in keeping with his Pharisee liberalism from scriptural commandments. He would have been horrified by the notion that he had renounced his Jewishness and his Torah for another religious creed. Paul, whose only scripture was the Old Testament, he based his reforms on the biblical hope and belief that the Messiah would come, and he believed the crucified Rabbi Jesus was the Messiah, that he knew nothing of the life of the itinerant rabbi, cast doubt on historicity in the gospel, and we lack any other genuine corroboration of Jesus' gospel existence. The sole source of knowledge of Jesus is in the Gospels themselves. Each of these Christological statements opens 1 million tons of theory and debate every place, but I'm summing at least what I believe and think here in a few simple words. Of Paul, in God of the New Testament, is God in the New Testament, or is the main actor Jesus? Big question. I'm actually floating most of the time because I'm seeing it pretty well. God is essentially absent in the New Testament, except for the unidentified voice in the sky in Mark 1:10. So Gospels are either, can you hear me, by the way? Is this good? So Gospels are either a godless scripture with the God of the Jews gone, or a new scripture with Jesus replacing Yahweh. Jesus is the active force of miracle and redemption. For most Christians, Jesus is the active God one prays to. In life, he is seen on earth, and later on diverse statues and painted images. For the benefit of the arts, the forbidden Greco-Roman graven image is back. But God himself stands in no church niche. There are some paintings of God, such as Michelangelo's famed Sistine Chapel fresco of the Creation, and scattered Italian, Dutch, French, and European wall paintings. There are no statues of God in churches, convents, and ministries. With these dramatic changes in God's identity, Jesus has many theological roles. He is a man, or a God-man, or the Son of God, or God himself. If Jesus is God, what happens to God the Jew? Do we have two gods? Is Jesus is God? The original question, is God a Jew, is answered very clearly. For Christians, God is not a Jew. God is a Christian. God is even a Christian in the Jewish Bible. It is common sense knowledge that the familiar God who created the world and Eve and Adam has taken a powder in the Greek scriptures. Old God is now a third-person reference in the New Testament, not a first-person activist like Jesus. In later centuries, Jesus himself wears many earthly costumes. He is a philosopher, poet, a miracle magician, king of the Jews, savior, and Jew hater. Fellow Jews are the Jesus killers. How Jews disappear from the Jewish Bible. The Christian world affirms the divinity of Lord Jesus, Son of God, and maybe God himself. He was never a mere rabbi from the diabolical Near East Jews. God is a Christian, and the Jewish God is dead. That old God was presumably the creator of the cosmos and chatted words in Hebrew to scribes for a book which is his chef d'oeuvre. But now in the New Testament, God is not a Jew, and buckle your seatbelts. There are also no Jews in the Jewish Old Testament. Each line in the Jewish Bible becomes an entirely Christian verse. The Jews have become euphemistically the children of Israel, B'nai Yisrael, and the Israelites, meaning Israelis but never Jews. No Jew could fathom the idea that these formulaic epithets have eliminated the Jew in the Bible. But where have all the young Jews gone? Where have all the flowers gone? Sings Pete Seeger. Will no one understand? Consider how the 47 translators in the wondrous King James edition not only erased Jews as Jews from the Hebrew Bible, but typologically referred to Christ everywhere in their Old Testament translation. Other translations do the same. They invented a two-barrel shotgun in that they wipe out both the Jew and also knock out the Jewish God and the Jewish prophets, replacing them with the pervading presence of Christ in the Jewish Bible. Read these overhead captions and annotations in Solomon's Song of Songs. In the unsurpassed Oxford World Classics edition of the King James edition by Robert Carroll and Stephen Pritchett, each page has an interpreted overhead. The church's love unto Christ, the calling of the church, the grace of the church, Christ's love to the church, the graces of the church. In the next book, Isaiah, again each page has an overhead. The coming of Christ's kingdom, the blessings of Christ's kingdom. Christ is promised, Christ's kingdom in birth, Christ's peaceable kingdom. In the annotation included in good Catholic editions, every line is interpreted to affirm its Christian meaning. As a result, there are no Jews in the Old Testament, and God himself is a Christian in his Christian Old Testament. So where are the goddamn Jews? The answer lies belligerently in the New Testament. As Jews who have been hibernating nowhere and absent even in their own Hebrew Bible suddenly pop up maliciously all over the gospel terrain as the despicable opponents of Jesus. In truth, these despise should include Jesus, who should despise himself for being a Jew, and so should Mary, Joseph, Simon, Peter, John, and James. But their names have been changed to disguise their Semitic origin. Their real names, we know, were Yeshua, Miriam, Yosef, Shimon, Kepha, Yohanan, and Yaakov. The hated ones should also include all the unnamed followers who followed Jesus through Galilee and Judea. They are the poor, the hungry, and often the homeless, and Jesus is their hope. But in the New Testament, not one of these walkers is a Jew. The Jews are demons who doubt Jesus. After a list of terrifying woes that the Pharisee Jews, which should include Pharisee Paul, will suffer when their Jerusalem is destroyed, Jesus utters, "You are descendants of those who murdered the prophets. You snakes, you brood of vipers. How can you escape being sentenced to hell?" Matthew 23, 31 to 33. By the end of Matthew's infamous chapter 27, every Jew is cursed now and forever. On the night of the Seder, the Jews are in the street, strangely screaming their guilt to the world, asserting that they are Christ killers, and shout that they themselves must be punished. Jesus' blood be upon us and on our children. Matthew 27:25. Is this self-destroying scene credible? No. It is merely another crude attempt to blame the Jews for the Roman execution of Jesus and get the later Roman Christians immunity for murdering their own Messiah. While Matthew, source of the New Testament's most profound, beautiful, and poignant spiritual poetry, also contains the worst rants of hatred against the Jewish devils. This world hoax has shocked a multitude of fine contemporary Christian Bible scholars who are grieved by the horrors inherent in their religion of love. We'll hear them speak, but first, the touching and oh so sad example of duplicity in the beautiful canonical to the Hebrews. To the Hebrews, another weird identity. There exists one beautiful canonical epistle, not too canonical, but by an Alexandrian Jew, in which the Jew is actually treated with dignity. Yet this major work of poetry and theology carries the disturbing title in English of To the Hebrews, as if to broadcast that the Hebrews are here, not the vile Jews of the Gospels. The title in Greek, pros Evreos, means in straightforward English, to the Jews was not cognate to the Hebrews. Everywhere else in the English New Testament, the same word, Evreos, refers to Jews. Why here now suddenly to Hebrews? Why not are these good Jews suddenly Hebrews? They are infelicitously Hebrews to separate them from contemptible Jews. The New Testament translators have been diligent in augmenting the tale's prevailing bigotry. The dark tradition of scholarly translation is based, as in the Greek, not on obscuring Jewish identities in the cause of anti-Semitism, alas. When weeping Mary of Magdala is looking for the tomb of Jesus, she runs into the resurrected Jesus. We read, Jesus saith unto her, Mary. She turned herself and saith unto him, Rabboni, which is to say, Master. John 20:16. John in the Greek and his KJV translators know that Rabboni means my great rabbi, yet fearing that the reader might understand that Mary is indeed addressing her great rabbi, a Jew, John informs the reader not to take the word Rabboni literally. Such false explanation has been effective throughout in erasing Jewish identity. The cover-ups in the Greek are enhanced in translations in a politic of immaculate concealment of Jesus' identity. Bloom accuses, no Jew can possibly understand how there are no Jews in a translation of the Tanakh. When Christianity became a religion, its first and only texts were the Tanakh, certainly until 70, when the Jews and Christians didn't have anything. There were no New Testament at all for at least another 50 years. And that's a long but fascinating question. As the books of the New Testament were gathered and assembled and finally canonized in 405 by Pope Innocent I in the West, Christianity rejected Judaism as a source text, though it retained both Old Testament and its Greek scriptures about the lives of Jews, which we now call the New Testament, or more properly, the New Covenant, Kine Diatheke. Professor Harold Bloom does not go gently into a dark night of submission in expressing his uneasiness with respect to the Christian appropriation of the Bible in what he calls this 2,000-year-old theft. The Old Testament is a captive work dragged along in the triumphal weight of Christianity. Tanakh, the Jewish Bible, is the original. The New Testament actually is the belated testament. I wince, this is Bloom, when my students speak of the Old Testament, New York Review of Books. Let us consider a possible incident in 1942. My son tells me, you do a lot better, Dad, when you write metaphor than when you talk. So let's see if this gets to you. Let us consider a possible incident in 1942 in Vichy, France. God, like a venerable old bearded Jew, is rounded up by the SS soldiers in Paris. He is discovered gazing at the ruins of the main synagogue in Montmartre just after it is bombarded by the German military. God is taken to Gestapo and Vichy headquarters at number 1, numéro 1, Place des Petits Pères, a block from Le Palais Royal, where he is shackled and interrogated. Then he is sent to the transport hub for sending Jews to Third Reich death camps. At Drancy, he is shoved into a boxcar jammed with other Jews. Destination, Auschwitz. At the infamous railroad station in Birkenau, Captain Dr. Joseph Mengele sits on the rusted platform awaiting all arrivals. He chooses who goes directly to the oven, who to the barracks. The surgeon who experiments on live prisoners is nicknamed the Angel of Death, an epithet from Hebrew Psalm 89. Dr. Mengele does not waste a second before assigning God to the gas chamber. God has no false Christian identity papers to prove himself an Aryan. You could not fool Mengele. If Mengele had also rounded up Jesus, circumcised on the 8th day, as well as Mary, Joseph, and the evangelists and the epistles, none would pass. all would perish in the gas chambers and become ashes in the ovens, from dust to dust, from ashes to ashes. Changing Jew to Judean. A number of new translations have changed the word Jew in their versions to diminish the accusations of villainy and guilt against the Jewish Jesus' co-religionists. This protective gesture assumes that to be a Jew is inherently an evil, dangerous epithet and is best to divest the Jews of their religious denomination. So Jew is written as opponent or Judean euphemisms to spare the Jew abuse of being called the dirty word Jew. Avoiding the word Jew is patently inaccurate and enforces the more underlying misconception that Yeshua and his family and followers were not Jews. For a mob of reasons, it is absurd to say God is a Judean. Changing names is the scourge of the New Testament. Let me repeat that line because I think it's one worth all of us to remember. Changing names is the scourge of the New Testament and enemy of truth. It is uniquely responsible for identity theft in the Greek scriptures. This practice has falsely created hatred. If Jesus and his family and followers were revealed to be Jews, there could be no massacres of his co-religionists. The tradition of using Greek for the authentic Hebrew and Aramaic names of New Testament figures causes them to lose their Jewishness in a worldwide identity theft. Hence, Christians can simultaneously criminalize Jews, yet not criminalize Yeshua as a Jew, nor his mother Miriam and father Yosef. Jesus himself follows Torah and, like other Jews, rebels against many provisions, including his own family, as well he should as a good anarchist Jew. The complete disappearance of Yeshua's Jewishness dumbfounds common sense and history. The hoax of Jesus' identity is the center of Christian reception of the New Testament. It has been for 2,000 years. Modern scholars know better. The unending attacks against the infidel Jew lead theologians to speak out. The Christian theologian Marcus J. Borg corrects at all levels. Jesus was deeply Jewish. It is important to emphasize this obvious fact. Not only was he Jewish by birth and socialization, but he remained a Jew all his life. His scripture was the Jewish Bible. He did not intend to establish a new religion, but saw himself as having a mission within Judaism. He spoke as a Jew to other Jews. His earlier followers were Jewish. All of the authors of the New Testament, with the possible exception of the author of Luke Acts, were Jewish, though I find it hard to believe some Christians are apparently unaware of the Jewishness of Jesus, or if they are aware, do not give it much weight. Moreover, Christians have frequently been guilty of conscious or unconscious anti-Semitism, identifying Jesus with Christianity and his opponents with Judaism, and thereby seeing Jesus and the early Christian movement as thoroughly anti-Jewish. The separation of Jesus from Judaism has had tragic consequences for Jews throughout the centuries. The separation is also historically incorrect, and any faithful image of Jesus must take with utmost seriousness, his rootedness in Judaism. What scholars most lament, and here, in the course of time, I'm going to skip a brief paragraph of the deliberations in the Sanhedrin, which are the most awful of the Sappho, of the Passover plot, which I've also referred to, which it just goes beyond belief that Sanhedrin plot. The devil Jews even reached Renaissance Michelangelo, who tucks devil horns into the hair of his Moses statue in the church of San Pietro in Vicole in Rome, is how I finish. Enlightened Pharisee Jews are cartooned as villains, but St. Paul survives. In the Roman Empire favoring Gospels, there is a controversy between two Jewish sects, the Pharisees and the anointed Messianics. The portrait of the wicked Pharisee is an historical concoction to distance Jesus from his people and join him to his Roman crucifiers. The most famous of the wicked Pharisees is Paul, whose birth name was Shaul, the philosophical and apostolic founder of Christianity, to whom 14 of 27 books of the New Testament are loosely ascribed. In these epistles, Paul calls himself a proud Pharisee from the tribe of Benjamin. Pharisee Paul and liberal Gamaliel, son of Simeon ben Hillel, believed in oral, not written law. Such freedom to interpret scriptures plays into Paul's freeing Judaism of the 3 commands of diet, Sabbath, and circumcision, and therefore making proselytizing more attractive. But the Pharisees were accused of being overtly obedient to Torah laws. This prevailing notion is a lie. So much for the Pharisee bugbear. Yet the word, even today, Pharisee, remains a nefarious hate word along with Judas, Hebrew for Jew. But happily, we have our deeply Pharisee Paul, author of Corinthians 13, his wise and intoxicating poem of love. Paul has the last laugh for those who read his extraordinary letters. Few do. Very few do. Almost no one. I translated them all, but the Jewish Bible echoes through the New Testament, cited through the Septuagint translation. And I think I'm going to jump ahead, I'm sorry, and I'll just say a few words about the shorter forms that we use in the Bible are kind of a little crazy. The name manipulations naturalizes the approved immigrant Semites who were never revealed as Semites. Imagine if we abuse foreign classics as we do the Bible. Think of Don Quixote de la Vega, anglicized to Don Quincy of Vermont, or Lady Murasaki to Mrs. Purple Murray, and Fyodor Dostoevsky to Fred Dustman. Unknown to the reader, the translators of earlier Bibles transformed our biblical ancestors from the Semitic Levant into European peoples. And I go on to say that the New Testament is in Greek, and all speak Greek, though none are Greeks. All Jews are masked in Greek names. The early saints Mark, Matthew, and Mary have graven icons. Greeks kiss as Greeks in chapels and monasteries, but they are really kissing Jews. Even today, Greeks see themselves as the first Christians operating in the New Testament, but there are no Greeks in the New Testament. Yeshua did not speak Greek and surely had no knowledge of the language he spoke, and as we all know, Aramaic. And I will go on. Now, the restored New Testament. Good people read uncritically, hoping to effect change in our reception of the Greek scriptures. I retranslated the New Testament. In 2009, Norton brought out my restored New Testament. Therein, I reestablished the original Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek names of all proper nouns, that is, of all persons in place. I have confirmed the ethnic identity of Yeshua and his family and followers by restoring the probable Hebrew and Aramaic epithets. And I say I hope this will, in the future, be done by everybody. It's already been imitated. Amazingly, in 5 years, I can't tell you by how many people, and it makes me very happy. That restoration of proper names would do immense to cut out this absurd antithesis of two peoples. Today we read anglicized Greek gods as Zeus, Athena, and Artemis in 20th century translations, and it would be good to return to reading the original names. Views of the Jews in the metaphysical prophets. I'll end with these bits here. I wish to stray from looking at the caricature of Jew in the New Testament to depiction of the Jew in literature. The great poets I love assume the worst about Jews and Judaism. which in the past was perfectly normal. Consider Shakespeare's Shylock in Merchant of Venice, John Donne's Holy Sonnets, Ezra Pound's cantos, T.S. Eliot's nasty vilification of the Jew in early poems, and also think of many-sided John Donne. We admire Donne's extraordinary poetry and his profound sermons after he became Dean of St. Paul's Cathedral in London. In Meditation 19, he writes insuperably, "No man is an island, every man is a piece of the continent. Therefore never send to know for whom the bell tolls. It tolls for thee." From this sermon came Hemingway's novel's title, For Whom the Bell Tolls. However, in his last amazing 19 holy sonnets, written as the last thing he did in his life, we come upon Sonnet 11, in which he asserts that he, John Donne, is even worse than the Jews, since by his lack of faith, he crucifies Jesus daily, not just once, as the Jews have done. The portrait begins, "Spit in my face, vile Jews, and pierce my side, buffet and scoff, scour and crucify me." And it goes on with that beautiful language in that very mean way till the end. Adding to his disdain is biblical Jacob, whom he depicts as a shabby London beggar type, anticipating Charles Dickens' Fagin. But then come eloquent protests. The 17th century poet George Herbert, if you don't know George Herbert, go right home and read everything he wrote, condemns Christian usurpation of the Jewish Bible in his poem, The Jews. Do read Herbert's amazing The Jews. Harvard professor Henry Wadsworth Longfellow historically indicts Christians for harrowing the Jews in all times and lands in his insuperable The Jewish Cemetery at Newport. The cemetery lies next to the 18th century Portuguese-Spanish Turo Synagogue in Newport, Rhode Island. On the temple wall is a framed letter from George Washington, who says, "The government of the United States gives to bigotry no sanction, to persecution, nor assistance. May the children of the stock of Abraham continue to merit and enjoy the goodwill of the other inhabitants, while everyone shall sit in safety under his own vine and fig tree, and there shall be none to make him afraid. May the Father of all mercies scatter light and not darkness in our paths, and make us all in our several vocations useful here, and in his own due time and way, everlastingly happy." George Washington was also interested in liberty. I began this chat with God, the poet, creator, using two words in Hebrew, be light, Yehior, to bring cosmos and humans into being. God the Jew is a multi-personed author, and his talk with his creations gives us the tonic. His last prophet is his foretold Messiah, a rebellious Jew named Yeshua, who is also a world poet. I published a year and a half ago the poems of Jesus Christ. He was a great poet, as so many people in the Bible are, but it's just Bible prose. They're not prose. It was all written as verse. Read Alter's book or anybody's book. We should know that. Between God and Jesus, they composed two Bibles, Torah and the magical Greek scriptures. Their two books are our spiritual and literary foundation. Without their composite Bible, there would be no Milton's Paradise, no metaphysical poets, no social and mystical Blake to make sunflowers grow at night, no Whitman to sing the earth beneath his boot, no Job, Mad Melville, and no Murder in the Cathedral by T.S. Eliot. There would be no word genius James Voice, no songman Dylan Thomas to entrance us as he romps through his Bible-saturated mischief in pious and impious landscapes. The Bible will remain as long as the sun rises at daybreak. We are enriched by its words and meditations of generosity, yet we are also stricken on its desert of historical misinformation. The magnificent plain talk, poetic gospels remain throughout in Greek and translations as the grand forgery of the world. Its diatribes against Pharisee hypocrites and its eternal woe plagues on vile Jews resemble its petty imitator, the protocols of Zion. About authorship, we know nothing about who wrote the Gospels. Scholars suggest 3 Jews and an undetermined Luke. These attributions seem to me a dodge, since no Jew or professed Jew in his or her right mind could write such a murderous tract against the Jews, very effectively so. Our Neoplatonist St. Paul would have been horrified by the slander in the Gospels that recreate his Jewish Messiah, Yeshua, as a Jew killer who condemns all Jews, now and forever to hell. But wait, remember, equally creepy is the repeated glorified Romans who crucified Jesus and who were left off the hook for killing the Messiah. And in a classic case of switch and bait, the Roman crime was laid at Jesus' own people's feet. To blame the Jews for this crime, you need to magically separate Jesus and all his followers from their Jewishness. It doesn't matter how illogical and transparent that deception in the Gospels is. What matters is its consequence, which has been 2,000 years of obscuring Semitic identity of all New Testament heroes like Rabbi Yeshua and family. This identity theft has bequeathed us the Inquisition burnings, the countless pogroms, the persecutions, the expulsions, and the extinctions of Jewish people. The world must recognize the scam of false identities and thereby free the Bible's illuminating philosophy, spirit, and compelling story from its obsessive hatred of the Jew, and see rather the roaming poet of the soul. It was not difficult for me to do this last year when I published the poems of Jesus Christ. There is endless beauty and wisdom in Jesus, or as a major poet, to carry us through a life. Much of his wisdom poetry, which comprises most of his speech, echoes Hebrew Bible and the Gospel of Thomas, circa 55 BCE, composed several decades before the canonical Gospels. In the Gospel of Thomas, there is a metaphysical Jesus and disciples, but there is no story, which brings us back to the Jesus Paul adored and worshipped. I repeat, be immersed in the dark, disturbing, tragic story, but suspend thinking, if possible, on the horrifying accusations. There is enough sage beauty in the Gospels to carry us through each day with wonder. In Common Speech, T.S. Eliot tells us where we are in part 5 of Little Gidding, the last of his 4 quartets. We shall not cease from exploration, and the end of all our exploring will be to arrive where we started and know the place for the first time, which takes us back to our beginning. Is Jesus or Yahweh a Jew? Yes. Is Jesus or Yeshua a Jew? Yes. That is all we need to know to tune a peaceable earth with happiness. Thank you. I don't know what the hell I read. I've been going a little blind with my left eye lately. Yeah. Yes.
Thank you very much. So now I think that Willis will give some more of his time to answer questions, so if there are questions.
Yeah. I think we left something out here because I said it, I've been reading also copy after copy. The last one ended with, and if you want to throw tomatoes at me, please do. Make sure they're nice and ripe and red so it'll be good on my bad tongue. So please, anything, and please ask the difficult questions, and if I can be of any help.
Thank you for the lecture.
Sorry.
So if God is a Jew, are we wrong when we call him the Christian God?
I'm sorry, I don't hear very well. What is this question?
My question is, if God is a Jew,
Yeah,
so are we wrong when we call him a Christian God?
I didn't hear the last part.
A Christian God.
If God is a Jew, I didn't hear the last
Are
question.
we wrong when we call him a Christian God? Wrong.
If we call him a Christian God.
Well, you're asking my opinion. Christians don't think it's wrong. Just read almost any good, solidly annotated book, and God is annotated throughout. My favorite translation is not very beautiful, is the Jesuit Jerusalem Bible. On every line of the Old Testament, God is a Christian, not a Jew. And every line of the Old Testament is a forecast of Jesus' coming. Yes?
Thank you very much. I think it's very difficult to ask questions to a poet.
Really? Poets are big
Because
blabbermouths.
your talk is very poetic, but has a lot of important thoughts, of course. My question is about translation. I do translations professionally, like you do,
Yeah.
and in order to understand the language Hebrew, there were already translations by the Jews in Greek times, in Roman and early Greek times. So
You're referring to the translation in Greek of the Septuagint, which is falsely said to be the 3rd century, but it was actually the 2nd century. And it didn't take 70 days, it took 75 years.
No, well, in a way, the Septuagint is basically the earliest version we have.
That's right. That's how we get the word Christos, you know.
But
Meaning
it's sort of
the anointed.
inherent in these texts to be translated, and there's nothing wrong with that,
With what?
with translations. So you, in a way, you also tone down or not denigrated, but certainly had a lower opinion about the Greek. Do I understand that well?
I think I get the point. You're saying that the reason I'm for or against, I left out a big hunk because it's too long, about how now we are beginning to recognize that in other languages, unlike the past, the French still think that Zeus, we should not call him Zeus. They're giving always the Roman gods instead of the Greek gods. But if you give names for the people who were Jews and make them Greek names like, say, Maria, which is a Greek name, her name was Miriam. Why, for example, in translation, and I say this in my book, Poetics of Translation, which came out with Yale in 1993, why every time you refer to a Jew, he's translated as Jakobos in Greek, Jacob in English. But every time he's a Christian, they refer to him as James. That is so we will not confuse any Christian with any Jewish background. And that is what has happened, if you understood what I was trying to say.
No,
and
you made your
wrong
point.
with using Greek names selectively and using them to disguise the fact that they were Jews.
But even in the Septuagint, some of these names were already translated into Greek for a Greek audience, for a Jewish Greek audience.
Yes.
So my point is that translation is necessary at the level to...
Yes, but I know very well the Septuagint, right? I know it extremely well, and I enjoy it, and it's a beautiful kind of Greek. But it was not translated ever to when they referred to the Messiah as Christos. It was not because they were thinking in the future that we will call the Messiah Christ, from which we get the name, Christos meaning a quality of Jesus as being anointed with olive oil on the head. No, there was no Jew in Alexandria who read the translation, who thought that this was not a book about Jews for Jews. But when you get to the New Testament and the translations of the New Testament, and then the editions, modern ones of even the Old Testament, suddenly the Jews are not in the Old Testament for many people. They're the children of Israel. The only references at all to the word Jew appears a few times in Esther, and I think once or twice elsewhere, studiously avoided. So they're called something else which is sufficient to keep our minds from it. Yes, Pablito.
Would you call it a conspiracy?
Would I call it conspiracy? Well, I whatever bad word you have for it is fine with me. I'm sorry to say that. It's bad because the authors of the translators of the 47 translators of the Hebrew Bible and the Greek scriptures knew Hebrew, not as well as they should have, but pretty well. And they knew exactly what they were doing when they disguised, as I mentioned, who the people were. And for them to go along with the translations, why when it says rabbi in the Greek in Mark, he made some mistakes, so they didn't edit it out. Why not say that? He's always Kyrie, master.
That's what you seem to imply in the Boile's translation.
Yes, exactly.
It was conspiratorial.
Well, I mean, yes, it was conspiratorial, but not in the sense that the Sanhedrin is supposed to be a group of people getting together. I think it was just common. It happens every place. People change names of countries so that you can start out again. They did it in ancient China. They do it every place in Asia, every time a new dictator takes over. It's a common trait. You want to kill the father. You don't have to know Freud to understand that and start anew. But I think in the case of Christianity, one of the main problems was, how do you have a Roman Catholic religion or an Orthodox religion where your hero has been killed by the members of the Roman Empire? And so the poor, reluctant Pilatus is forced and scared, it says, by the Jews. No, unbelievable.
I have another question, and then
Yeah.
I'm going to shut up. What about the Muslim God?
The what?
The Muslim God, Allah.
Same word for God, right? I love the fact that in Spanish bullfights they all say Allah, meaning ole. Yeah, right. I think I was talking today to Giovanni, saying that we know almost nothing about the beginnings of Arabic, the Saudi religion. We have even less knowledge, and that was 7th century, than we do about the Jews 7 centuries earlier. And so we just don't know, and I don't know much about it myself. So I can't really answer that question. Yes?
Thank you for the lecture. How far back can we trace this tradition or pattern of replacing, as you say, the Jacobos?
Yes.
Jew Jacobos would be.
I think it happened as early as it happened very strongly in the Vatican, not the Vatican, in the Vulgate. And we see almost all these name changes right there. And then they were repeated in English translations from the Vulgate. I mean, that's surely one of the main sources of it. Yes. And beyond that, I couldn't say. I mean, there are a lot of fragmentary things but the Vulgate is really the first major translation. And that's the one that set the tone. Dean, do you have any? Yes. Yes. Well, yes.
Hello. I've never found myself weeping in an energy seminar, which I usually go to. So you have this poetic way about you, for sure, as someone else said. And imagination is a big part of poetry. And I imagine Miriam taking little Yeshua in the Harvard of Alexandria that would have existed when they left to Egypt.
Yes.
And did this, and then Yeshua in the temple in Jerusalem when he was 12 asking the leaders.
Yeah.
I can understand very clearly what you're saying, that Jesus had no intention of changing religions.
Yeah.
From when he was a small child with his tutor in Alexandria to in the temple.
Yeah.
It's just quite fascinating. I just wanted to say that, but I know when I was 12 years old, I had this goal that I wanted to do, and I can just picture Yeshua having this goal of wanting to learn what the leaders of the temple could not answer in his own questions.
Yeah, well, I'm all for rebellion. And I'm not opposed to so many of the good things, but there's a schizophrenic quality to Jesus. He is the militant genius, Jesus, the one who goes on for 10 pages of the woes the plagues that are going to happen to the Jews for killing their prophets. It's said over and over again in the New Testament, and all these things like that. But at the same time, you have the other Jesus. So that's why I say you can have the best people in the world, think of love and forget that nastiness. But I think it's important to know that the other aspect does exist. And I don't think it's because Jesus is worse. I mentioned that God of the Old Testament was a brutal monster killing people as he went along. And he was also the person of love. Yes, Fred?
Thank you, first of all. I'd like to go back to the question of letting the Romans off the hook. Can you use the mic, please? Sure.
Yeah.
I'd like to go back to the question of letting the Romans off the hook.
Yes.
And the conspiracy quotes. To what extent, Willis, do you think that fear of any kind of persecution by the empire played a role in that desire to make the Romans innocent in some way or another?
I didn't quite, understood you too then, but what's the last question?
I'm curious about whether or not you think whoever the gospel composers were they terrified by the Roman Empire and its power? Not only currying the possibility of future whatever, but really fearing that, and that so that the Romans get get taken off the hook, in part for that reason.
Well, I'd like to answer that very quickly if I can. By the way, I first want to say 2 people have mentioned that I've given you a poetic interpretation, which is said with compliments and negativity. I was a professor of semiotics. I've written so many blind, mind-blowing, difficult to understand books. You cannot just look at my bibliography. But I think it's not a bad idea to speak so everybody can understand. And, it doesn't take Jesus was a poet. He didn't speak in theory. We should deal with our scholarly work. It's coming around a lot. Things are changing. Anyway, so the question is what about letting the Romans off the hook and how important it was? Well, you read a book like Revelation, which is the great epic poem. Can you hear me? We read a book like the Revelation, which is the great epic poem of the Bible. And here are these Jews in Cappadocia, or early Christians, and they're scared to death. Everybody's scared to death. And then they have the magic number, but it's not Nero. It's Augustus who's been killing the Jews. Like that's the person. It's absolutely certain that it was Augustus. And so, on the one hand, I say it's schizophrenic because the Roman Empire with Constantine accepted things, and things were great after that. I mean, in terms of no Roman or East European persecution of Christians. But until that moment, you have a very difficult problem, and an insoluble problem, because it's clear that, how do the Romans act? There's a Roman centurion who helps the woman, and suddenly they say he's the only truly good man in Israel. Makes sense? He's the Roman occupier. And at the Jews, and as I mentioned before, in 4 Gospels, you find it, they finally shout, Christos Anesti, which they shout in Greece, as you know, and at Christ. But how is it possible for any of us to believe that 4 common soldiers are going to look at the man they've just slaughtered and then suddenly say, he is the Son of God, and then be heroes? Of course that's put in as part of the attempt to save the Romans from the very fact that these people are the first true Christians, the first to recognize Jesus' divinity. That's amazing. But that is false. Who can believe it? Yes.
Thank you very much. I really appreciated that lecture. My question is, I'm wondering if, as a Christian, the more I know about the Jewish heritage, I feel more enriched. And I'm wondering if the change of names into the Jewish names, if that would make the Gospels more acceptable and more widely read, including by Jewish people?
I think so tremendously. And I also think it would help. Almost no Jew, unless they're in divinity school, has read the New Testament because they consider that is a death warrant, and it has been. I mean, Jews are frightened stiff even to know about it, but they just know that's what gets them killed. So if it were someday possible for everybody to know what the actual, I can't say truth is, there's no such thing as truth, but probability is, then we would have to have grave doubts about old angers and realize we can be all ecumenically one people. That it began as a Jewish sect, and then, as the Protestants separated from the Catholics, etc., we should all live happily together and not with hatred. And it has never been it's never been a history of except you mentioned in Spanish. Obviously, the best time for Jews has always been under Islam, except the last part of the 20th century, which is a horrible thing. But it's not the Jews, the Arabs, the Muslims were not interested in, they were interested in killing Christians, and Christians were interested in killing Muslims. No one was after the Jews. It was a little bit like during the war in Bosnia and so forth. There were a lot of Jewish doctors and so forth who acted as mailmen because they weren't the enemies. They weren't either Bosnians or whatever. I think it would be of great, great help.
Thank you.
And I think that, we do know about the Jews. We do read the Hebrew Bible, except we don't really understand that these were Jews, and we don't understand that they're the same people who are supposedly so hateful in the New Testament. Yeah. Thank you.
I think our time is over, so let's say thanks to you.
Thank you for your patience. I appreciate it. It's been a tremendous pleasure for me to be here.